When you think of a keyboard, you probably imagine something like this. This design has been around for more than a century, and yet we remain on it. But should we? Today we'll be primarily looking at 4 keyboards. First, we have the common keyboard, called a staggered or a row stag keyboard. Second, an Arisu or Alice keyboard. Next, a column stagger keyboard, known commonly as a Stag. And finally, the Dactyl or Manuform or Keywell keyboard for the quote-unquote endgame pick, at least for standard input. The reason I say this is because there are many non-standard input keyboards, like chording with a jar recorder or Svalboard, for example, that promise even more optimization. Unfortunately, these are rather expensive, and well, I'm not monetized yet, so maybe someday. But that aside, just telling you the names of these keyboards only goes so far. Let's dive straight into part 1, theory. Each of these keyboards are designed almost sequential to one another in terms of design. Hence, we're gonna start with the original, staggered. If I were to ask someone to draw me a keyboard quickly, most likely they would draw something like this, a big grid. This is actually a type of keyboard that is called ortholinear. We'll talk more about this in a bit. The main thing is, this kind of keyboard seems intuitive. It's symmetric and it's consistent. So why weren't keyboards designed like this in the first place? Well, it's because of the godfather of keyboards, typewriters. Typewriters worked on a system of keys to key levers to type bars. When you press down a key, the key lever would connect your key press to the type bar, which prints the letter on the page. Now, if we were to use a grid-style keyboard like this one, the keys lever that you pressed would simply hit the key beneath it and therefore not work. So to fix this, we simply stagger the keys to the side. But here's the thing, we don't type on mechanically connected typewriters anymore. Our keys are connected through copper and silicon. We don't really have the same need for staggering our keys like the typewriters anymore. So why don't we go back to the design we drew? This is an ortholinear keyboard. I know I kind of omitted this keyboard from our ergonomic introductions. The reason is because, as I personally believe, ortholinear is the worst of ergonomic keyboard designs. Maybe even worse than row stag. The theory of ortholinear, as I've heard it, comes somewhat from the numpad. Now imagine what happens if you duplicated it and mushed it together in the middle. This is basically an ortholinear keyboard. What this means is that when you try and type on an ortholinear keyboard, your arms bend in at an upside down V shape, which carries onto your fingers. So what was before aligned with your fingers now are unaligned. If you try and realign them by bending your wrists, you reintroduce a whole load of problems that I'm not qualified to explain. But we can fix this. Let's take a quick step back to staggered. All we're gonna do is split this in half and rotate it out a bit, like this. All fixed? This is an Arisu or Alice keyboard layout. There isn't much to say about its design theory other than what I just did, accounting for wrist deviation. Although there are many modifications that surround these that I won't get into. The basics are though that wrist angle, called wrist deviation, ulnar or radical, is maybe not resolved but greatly benefited. But why stop there? Instead of limiting ourselves to a single angle limited by the physical design of the keyboard, let's just fully chop it in half. Now yes, split ortho keyboards exist. I know well of them. But when ortholinear was popular, the majority of them were simple monoblocks. And also, they're very similarly priced to what is this. This is a column stagger keyboard, or stack. Most of them are fully split, like this one, which allows you to position each half at any angle and even at any distance you want. Very nice. But that's not all. Your fingers are different lengths, right? So we can stagger each column to account for this. While it may seem a bit silly to do this, it actually helps a lot with what are called scissors, 2 adjacent fingers moving in the opposite directions. For example, take the ring and pinky finger. Let's say you need to curl your ring finger, but extend your pinky. Depending on how long your fingers are, this motion of pressing Q and X on QWERTY can be rather difficult. But if we decide to, say, shift the pinky column down a bit, suddenly this top key becomes a whole lot easier to reach. Two relatively simple but effective and significant changes. At the same time, in regards to ortho, it inherits the reduced distance, leading to a win-win. With all of that, how do we improve from here? Well, we need to go third dimensional. This is a Dactyl, or Manuform, or Keywell keyboard, and there's some other names as well. The most obvious design iteration of this is the sort of dent or concavity in the middle. But there is one other thing we need to get to first. Tensing. Again, just like ortho keyboards, yes, you can, and perhaps even commonly, find tensing on Colstag. But again, Dactyls almost always come tented, as opposed to usually add-ons for Colstags. But back on track. Tenting is the tilting of the keyboard to better account for wrist pronation. Believe it or not, your wrists being in a flat position isn't the greatest for your health. By tilting the keyboard so that your arm is a bit more supinated, you gain a surprising amount of increase in comfort. Now, by how much these improve and whether there are actual health benefits is a question that I can't quite answer, but at least for me and for many others, it is certainly more comfortable. Number 2 is where the name of the keyboard, Keywell, actually came from. The keys are staggered depth-wise, as in they form a sort of well in the middle. The idea behind this is very similar to that of Colstag keyboards. By staggering the depth of the keys, we are able to account for the differing length of the fingers, but now also when they are pressing or releasing. Whether this is actually remotely better is a whole nother question. But in any case, I hope you can kind of see the developmental timeline these keyboards followed. Yes, they are not arranged in historical order, but you can kind of see how one may lead to another, or at the very least, how each optimization is created or used. But anyways, that's enough about what things could be. How do these keyboards actually perform in practice? Well, let's find out. Along with my own personal use of these keyboards, I also interviewed some well-regarded typists to get their opinions on these style of keyboards. However, what we discussed became rather complex and introduced some terms and ideas that I need to explain. So let's do that. To start off, we have to go back to row stack keyboards. As I said earlier, given certain modifications, ortholinear keyboards can be even worse than that of row stack, and here's why. When typing on keyboards, the assumed way you're supposed to type is like this, with each color corresponding to each finger. However, the reality is, many people don't actually type like this. For example, a lot of people use their ring finger to press backspace, as opposed to that of pinky. Now, people do this probably because the ring is stronger and also a bit longer. The important thing to take away is though, you don't have to press a given key in so and so given way. There are better and other ways to press certain keys. This leads to certain situations where, let's say you need to press the B key and the R key. This, according to strict fingering, you would need to press both of these with index. However, this is quite a long jump and not very comfortable, and also takes a long time. So instead, we can simply substitute a finger. In this case, middle or ring to press that R instead. This is much quicker and arguably more comfortable, and this is facilitated by row stack, as the shifting of the top row towards the left brings each of the keys closer to each subsequent finger. Building on this idea, another important example is C. A lot of people, maybe even you watching, comment if you do, press QWERTY C with index instead of what it's supposed to be, middle. Now this in and of itself is pretty minor, but it leads to an idea that is very critical. As we discussed, one of the problems with ortholinear is the lack of accounting for wrist deviation. Staggered normally would suffer from this same problem, except we can actually fix this without changing anything physically. This is known as the angle mod. By shifting every key on the bottom row, left by one key, the left hand essentially becomes that of the right hand, the keys following the natural finger motion, especially with the wrists in a comfortable angled position. These two mods boost staggered keyboards up a whole lot more than they may initially appear. There's also more optimizations, such as being able to use them to press certain keys and other stuff that I won't get to. In short though, the way staggered keyboards were designed has unintentionally brought on benefits, which if used properly can be even better than Ergo. But on the topic of other typing methods, we also have the alternative keyboard layouts. A keyboard layout is the arrangement of letters on a keyboard, the most common one being QWERTY, as you can see by the top left 6 keys. Alt layouts, as they're called, are different arrangements of these keys that focus on increasing typing efficiency and comfort in various ways. For example, in our BR example, it would simply be better if we just didn't have to have them on the same finger. As we'll get to this later, Assuming strict fingering, a simple layout change will have an infinitely higher effect than that of a physical change, again for standard input. I mean, it's pretty simple. There are only so many physical modifications one can make, while there are 41 factorial different arrangements of letters one can make. But adding on to our previous discovery, while these benefits are universal on all types of keyboards, certain ones can utilize the Rostag's unique setup to do more. One extreme example are these two layouts, Quasar and Meteorite. Instead of pressing the bottom middle position with middle, we are going to instead press it with index. Now we have 3 bottom index keys instead of 2. These two layouts take advantage of these slots by fitting 2 high usage keys in these positions instead of the usual 1. Another great example would be this layout. Quantum. One thing that may be immediately obvious is that MY belongs on the same finger. This isn't great. We want to avoid pressing keys with the same finger as it's slower than if you were to use 2 different ones. However, because M is shifted so far right due to the stagger, it is actually quite comfortable to press with the middle. Thus, MY is instead pressed with middle and index. Thus, MY can be substituted to be pressed with middle and index. And this can extend past just same hand letters. Many top typists are known to type letters on the opposite hand in the sake of efficiency. With most ergo keyboards being split, this kind of becomes impossible. But that's enough rambling from me. Let's introduce our typists. Today I brought on 4 individuals. Danie, a well-respected alt layout typist who is insanely fast and experienced typing on many different keyboard layouts, including that of QWERTY. She's currently the 3rd fastest alt layout typist. Next up, Zior.
I got into keyboards.
Next, Eve. A well-respected alt layout creator, she is well known for not actually using any of her creations. Specifically, she uses alt-optimized QWERTY. Not to be confused with an alt layout, this simply means what we discussed earlier, using different fingers to press certain keys. QWERTY, in this regard, can be surprisingly flexible. So instead of making you wait for this, let's just jump straight into it. First up, Danie. She started typing on QWERTY like the rest of us, but she was pretty fast already, having a speed of around 180 words per minute before hopping onto alt layouts. Now, her layout journey is rather long, so the very simplified version is this. After QWERTY, she tried Comac, a bit of Dvorak, Canary, went back to QWERTY, but now reached 200 words per minute, and finally to what her highest speed is today, Quantum and Contem. But she's also tried many other layouts, and is probably faster than you on most, if not all of them. Because of this Interviewed focused primarily on speed typing. Her primary keyboard is a generic 60% with the Boba U4Ts. Now this is more unique in the typing scene as many prefer lighter and linear switches. The U4s are known as a rather heavy tactile switch, but this just goes to prove that your keyboard is probably not limiting you. But for ergo-wise, she has also used a Ferris sweep. But anyways, the first question was quite simple. Do you think typing on an ergo keyboard is faster? Not really. QWERTY actually becomes worse due to the increase in the difficulty of alts. Again, it is the staggering itself that helps facilitate some of these. As for an alt layout, it becomes slightly more comfortable at best, but no speed differences. How about some advantages and disadvantages for each? For Rostag, again, the big advantage is staggering. Because of the unique setup, something like the QWERTY B position can be taken advantage of in unique ways. The primary advantage of ergo is that the split allows for a more comfortable wrist setup or wrist angle. Finally, the big question. Do you think ergo keyboards are actually better than Rostag keyboards? Assuming you're using an alt layout, then yes, and for this, Colstag is probably the best. However, something like Ortho is frankly worse because of the lack of alts. So while ergo keyboards can be better, using an alt layout would be required to take advantage of it. While attempting to use QWERTY on these will lead to an honestly worse experience. In short, when it comes to typing fast, typing efficiently is important. The tiny benefit from moving a key a couple centimeters is not going to have the same benefit as being able to better optimize typing a word. In this situation, Rostag is especially powerful. At the same time, QWERTY relies heavily on this alting factor, which means without it, it really sucks to type on. This means using almost any sort of ergo keyboard will actually give you a worse experience, but maybe except Alice, as we'll hear from Zior.
I got into keyboards like my My first mechanical keyboard was like 2015 maybe, and back then I just wanted a good keyboard, but I got more into like layouts around 2017, which is when I got my plank. I've been typing casually since then, but only really got into typing when I joined MonkeyType.
What other types of keyboards have you used?
My first column stagger was Ergonomics that I already let go of because I don't like the thumb cluster. But I also have a Cornish Zen, which is also a split in split cool stag, and I have a couple other I bought. I also go to meetups to try keyboards, so I've tried most things I think at this point.
Why do you think Alice keyboards are designed the way they are?
There's been similar keyboards like the Microsoft, the ergonomic one, the membrane one. So I think a lot of inspiration was from stuff that already existed, but they just wanted in a high quality mechanical keyboard form factor.
Of all of them, which ones do you think are the most ergonomic?
We're speaking without the context of the software layout, probably just some split cool stag. One thing I don't like that much is sculpting, like the Dactyl. So the logic in my head is that the only difference is when you're resting at the home position, it's either your fingers are put on a flat surface or a concave surface, and I don't think anyone ever complained about it being uncomfortable to rest your hand on a flat surface. I do like sculpting where the top row and the bottom row is just curved in, so the resting position's still flat. I think that does make sense. The biggest benefit with Alice over those is the pinky. The pinky is shifted quite a lot down relative to the home row. And with Semi-Mac, I specifically like the pinky stagger. I don't like the index column stagger, but I do like the pinky stagger. So Alice just happens to be the perfect one that doesn't have index stagger but does have pinky stagger.
Big one. Since you've tried so many of these and you've bought so many of them, with consideration to cost, which ones do you think are the best and why?
If you're okay with DIY, CoolStag has a lot of good options if you look into it. But otherwise, if you don't care to build it yourself, there's pretty good Alice options nowadays. It has the most mainstream adaptation over like CoolStag.
In summary, he believes that alt layouts are very important when it comes to ergonomic typing. That really, using QWERTY on any sort of ergonomic keyboard gains little to no benefit. However, it is important to acknowledge that certain keyboard layouts will actually perform better or worse due to certain key placements. Finally, the idea of sculpting or Dactyl is unnecessary. Next, Eve. I didn't mean for this interview to be longer, however, I kinda ran out of questions. So in short, she agreed with Danie and said that RowStag works better for QWERTY, while ergonomic keyboards don't benefit much from QWERTY at all. And that's it from them. Again, a huge thank you to all. I've been using each of these for at least 3 months. Staggered, believe it or not, is my most recent, at least for speed-wise. So let's start with the pros of each one. Staggered, which I'm using with Angle Mod and a custom layout built essentially for it, it's flexible for speed typing. And without a doubt, it is my fastest and first pick. I recently just got my personal best of 190 words per minute with this exact keyboard. The reason is that alting is really powerful, and no amount of simple millimeter key distances will compare to that. Next, CoolStag. CoolStag is by far my longest used keyboard, for around 4 to 5 years now. The thing with CoolStag is that it is just a great all-rounder. It's got all the features you want, wrist angle, freely positioned, and even tenting if you really want to get into that. It has everything you need and nothing you don't. Finally, Dactyl. Dactyl is comfortable. Slightly more than CoolStag. Zigor brought up a really good point in that there really wasn't anybody who complained about the keyboard being flat. However, I do think that concavity can at least have some benefits. Specifically, like how on Staggered, the staggering reduces key distance for certain keys, the tilting of the keys on the index help bring it a tad closer. This also helps a bit with alting, albeit I probably wouldn't do it to the same degree as Staggered. Next, the curving up of the bottom row I find extremely nice. While on flat keyboards sometimes your finger can kinda slip on the bottom key due to the extreme curl, even in the case of Dactyl, Dactyl just feels natural, but again, it isn't necessary. The main benefit, at least for me, is tenting, which unfortunately, or fortunately, can also be present on Staggered, therefore not really valuing anything. Now for the cons. Staggered, of course, has the big one, being certain keys still suck, like the middle B position on QWERTY, which I've mapped to enter. Furthermore, the angle mod, while great on a desk, can still be misaligned when you're not in the perfect position. Alice is still better on this. Furthermore, since it doesn't have the vertical stagger, scissors and row jumps are still not great. Stag, in reference to other keyboards, it honestly doesn't have much. The only real downside is the lack of alts and other typing optimizations. If I were to really point out one, the biggest issue I personally have with Stag is that the ergonomics are usually not aggressive enough. For example, on the Iris, this tiny bit of Stag is just not enough for me. It helps, but I would say like the pinky down more. I suppose in that regard, another could be layout parity. For example, some keyboard layouts actually do worse on Stag because they put certain common keys in locations that on a staggered layout is great, but Stag is poor. Finally, Dactyl. While just like all other ergonomic keyboards, there is an adjustment time. Changing your mind to move your fingers sideways can be a little challenging. I still often accidentally mispress because my finger scraped against the side of another key. This is then magnified due to the concavity. The real negative of Dactyl is just that, as Igor said, I don't think it's necessary, but in that regard, let me do a quick summary. In my opinion, of all the keyboards mentioned in this video, without price, it is my opinion that Alice or Staggered are the best for speed typing, while Dactyl is technically the most comfortable. However, this is the real world, and we have to talk about monetary value. So, welcome to the last part of this video. Money. I'm just gonna leave Staggered out of this because it's obviously the most affordable, but believe it or not, Alice is the second most. Yes, even more than Ortho. I made a video a while ago essentially trashing just on Ortho. But one redeeming factor that I did give it back then was that it was indeed still cheaper than alternatives. However, with the fallout of Ortho, Alice especially and Stag have kind of caught up. For example, Alice often offers better features to a keyboard enthusiast than modder, offering gasket mount, more keys, and others for the same if not better price. And perhaps importantly for more people, baseline Stag isn't far away anymore. Albeit not the same build quality, something like Cornet or Soffel are great options. Ortholinear really has no justification. Next, on the other extreme end, Dactyls. Dactyls are still rather expensive, especially for their mostly 3D printed plastic build. The only really mass production one is the LiQWYD, which starting at $400 is definitely a pretty penny. I personally bought mine from a member of the community for $200, which, yes, is expensive, but fully built and soldered is an absolute steal for Dactyls. Pre-builts online usually sit around $300 and above, and marketplaces is a bit of a different story. In short, if you were to just buy one, it doesn't come cheap and is rather complicated. For that increase in price, you can easily tent a Stag with tripod mounts and many other options. However, if you were to fully build each of these keyboards using 3D printed parts, say, it's interesting. Primarily that of Dactyl. Hand wiring is something that has sort of died out as PCBs for ergonomic keyboards became more available. But Dactyl is the exception. Yes, there are PCBs, but the majority of DIY Dactyls are still hand soldered. This adds a layer of complexity, but also does save costs. In this regard, if you weren't going to use a PCB in the first place, changing from a Stag to a Dactyl ain't all that bad. There are plenty of open source designs and files you can permanently borrow. But jokes aside, if you're going full DIY, you have more flexibility, and you might as well go for a Dactyl in that case. In the end though, with all things considered, I still personally stand by Stag being the best. You can angle it, you can tense it, you can move it around. The build quality has nearly caught up in terms of price, and it just is an overall great experience, with price included. Staggered and Alice remain my personal pick for speed typing. I initially started off this video meaning to use Alice as another example of a poorly designed ergo keyboard. While I do think for ergonomics it's still meddling at best, it's great for speed, and still a little better than Staggered. Finally, for Dactyl, it's not really worth a hassle in my opinion. Again, from a non-medical perspective. The benefits you can gain are almost fully replicated on a cold stack, and even on a Staggered, for example, you can try Zior's 3D printed keycap shenanigans. I love my Dactyl, but frankly, I don't think it's worth the hype. In any case, hopefully this video helped you gain a bit of insights, and until next time, bye bye.